Welcome back. We are now at lecture 4 of module 7. We are discussing the theories of SLA. We started with the early approaches of contrastive analysis and then also had a brief discussion on the error analysis, interlanguages and then monitor model and universal grammar. So, now we will move on to the functional approaches. So, this is another set of approach towards understanding second language acquisition. So, functional approach is different from both the structuralist and the generativist perspectives. In structuralist, we talked about the contrastive analysis, which was dominated by the structuralism, by the behaviorist theories, and then the other theories were primarily based on the universal grammar or the innateness hypothesis in various degrees. But now the functional approach is different from both of them, and the traces of functional approach can be, we can trace it back to all the way to Prague School of Linguistics. Here the emphasis is not on the structure, but on the information content of the utterances. The focus here is slightly different as to what is uttered, what is conveyed, what is the information part, what is the information structure within the utterances. That is what is important, because communication, because this is functional. So, function of language is to communicate. So, what we communicate, where we communicate, with whom do we communicate, all of that will have an impact on how we learn our language. That is what my primary idea here is. So, the function of language is more important as opposed to the underlying rules or the kind of structure that you have. So, because language is primarily a system of communication. So, there are predominantly four different strands of principles, or let us say paradigms within the functional approach. So, it is not a homogeneous kind of a system. There are multiple ways of looking at the same thing, but the baseline is the same, that looking at language as a tool, looking at language as a communicative tool for the purpose of communication, that we use language, and that seems to have an important role as to how the language learning goes. So, systemic linguistics, functional typology, function to form mapping and information organization, these are the four different ways in which functional approach has been understood. Systemic linguistics was proposed by Halliday. The main idea here was language structure need to be studied in accordance with their context of use. Where are you using it? Because language in this case, as far as Halliday is concerned, there are it is a meaning making sort of a process, meaning generation process. So, what you say, why you say, and what do you want to convey is the crux of the entire thing here. So, he says that according to the purpose, according to where you are using the language, you may have a list of an array of options, and depending on that you will be using the language. So, to quote him, he says that learning language is learning how to mean. So, meaning is central here, because when you are trying to communicate, you have to mean. If you do not mean anything, if you speak like colorless, green ideas, sleep furiously, you are not conveying any meaning. So, that is an important distinction here. Meaning is the important thing. So, the goal of the learner is not to master rules, but to acquire the meaning potential. This is what he primarily says. So, how do you acquire the meaning potential? How do you understand what are the different ways in which certain different kinds of meanings can be conveyed in this particular target language? So, the pragmatic functions of the language is what is at the core of language acquisition when it comes to our L2. So, these are the pragmatic functions that he talked about. These are relevant for L1 and L2. It started with L1 and they all can be utilized for L2 as well. So, the functions, pragmatic functions are instrumental, regulatory, interactional, personal, heuristic, imagination, representational, and so on. So, instrumental is basically when language is used as a means of getting things done. Not strictly in the sense of a speech act, but typically you get something done out of by using language. So, you are using it as a tool. Similarly, regulatory, to regulate others' behavior, interactional, use of language in interaction between the self and others, and so on. So, a list of pragmatic functions that are at the root of using language. Initially started with L1 acquisition, and then he says that this theory says that the same kind of functions can be utilized for bilingualism as well, for when you are learning your second language as well, because you are simply multiplying the similar kind of meaning potential, right. So, based on this paradigm, mastering linguistic structures in the developmental process reflect the functions that language serves. So, what is the function out of those long list of functions? What is the function that your language serves that will decide the kind of structure a person is using? So, if you recall, in the previous lecture we talked about depending on what is the goal. If your goal is to be a tour guide and you are trying to learn the language of the tourists in order to be so that you are hired by tourists, that you speak their language, that is one kind of use. So, as a result of which your developmental processes will be different compared to somebody is learning a language to be able to read scholarly articles in that language. That will be different. So, that is the difference that he makes. The language use will reflect the developmental stages of the language structure. Okay. So, their development is closely related to the social and personal needs that they are used to convey. Then applied to SLA context, the model sees L2 acquisition as an addition of meaning potential. So, meaning potential as in what are the different ways you can use it. So, when you are learning another language, you are adding the meaning potential. So, to quote him, Saville Troike's second language acquisition is largely a matter of learning new linguistic forms to fulfill the same functions as already acquired and used in L1 within a different social milieu. So, you are learning another set of forms to utilize for the already existing meaning or let us say pragmatic functions that you already have in place. Your L1 has already created all those different pragmatic functions. Now, your another language that you are learning, you are now adding forms to not only to those pragmatic functions, but the new language might help you add some more meaning potential. So, you have basically you are expanding your meaning potential while you are learning another language, because ultimately that is what is the goal of language. That is what the this approach talks about, the systemic linguistics. Then we move on to functional typology. Now, typology, as many of you might be already aware about, typology is the domain of linguistics where we compare between among languages of the world. So, we classify. So, depending on, let us say there are different kinds of languages in the world, we look at the features of each of them, different kinds of features and the distribution of those features, and based on those analysis, based on those understanding, we classify languages into different groups. That is what typology does. So, when we are talking about functional typology, it basically integrates the consideration of language structure, meaning and use. So, typically when you are looking at typology as a sub-discipline within linguistics, when we look at typological understanding of languages of the world, we are looking at the structure, meaning and other properties like this. But when you are calling it functional typology, we are also looking at use, because the entire functional paradigm within SLA is about using the language. So, applied to SLA, this method explains as to why some L2 features are more difficult to learn than others, and some elements of L1 transfers to L2 while others do not. Because we are looking at L1 and L2 distinction in terms of the features, certain grammatical features, certain use of those grammatical features and so on. So, on the basis of that understanding, a thorough understanding of the similarities and distinctions among languages, across languages will tell us why certain L2 features are more difficult to learn and in which cases the L1 to L2 transfers are possible and in which cases they are not possible. In order to get there, there is an important idea of the concept of markedness. This is important within this domain to understand what gets transferred and what which concepts are more difficult to learn. So, the idea there are on the basis of the markedness principle, some features are marked and some features are unmarked. Now, what is unmarked? Unmarked is that category of features which are more frequently used than a contrasting element. So, basically this is more expected. Let us say you are the S marking in English language is a plural marker. So, having a plural marker as an inflection to the main root word is an unmarked property, right. So, this is what this is what is used in many languages. So, this is anything that is any structural property and its use that is most common, most frequently found and more expected are called unmarked. And those things that are less expected are called marked. Now, they can apply to any domain within the language structure. So, any level. So, for example, it can be in phonology, vocabulary, syntax, discourse, all of these things might have their marked and unmarked properties. So, in case of morphology, we just talked about the S marking. In case of sound, let us say certain sounds might be, certain phonological properties might be unmarked, certain features might be marked and so on, right. For example, let us say in case of phonology we can talk about the syllable structure. So, one of the most common syllable structure is CV, right. CV structure is the common structure, but there you can also have CV or you can also have triple 3 consonants and followed by 1 vowel. So, this will be a marked, this will be an unmarked kind of a structure. So, let us call it unmarked and this is marked. Why is it marked? Because this having 3 consonants followed by 1 vowel to create a syllable is comparatively, it is not that they are not existing, but they do exist, but they are less common. But CV structure is more common. Even the child when they start using some kind of a language like structure, this also comes in a CV format. So, that is why it is unmarked, it is very prevalent. So, let us say any kind of just take any language, you will find CV structure, but not all languages allow a complex structure like complex the triple 3 consonants followed by 1 vowel. For example, Polish might have or some other language like Russian might have, but not many other. Indian languages do have, but even when we do have, let us say in Indian language we have a word called stree. So, we have a word like this, right. So, you have C and then followed by a V. But even in this case, the number of such words are less. In Hindi also, Hindi allows this structure, but even then the structure is less. So, this is one case of unmarked versus marked distinction in the domain of phonology. Similarly, you might have many other in other domains as well. So, vocabulary as well in the syntax, discourse and so on. So, unmarked elements are expected to be learned before the marked ones. In LA acquisition also it happens. So, the same applies to L2, which is understandable because those features of a language, be it in whichever level, they will, those that are more common are typically learned first, then followed by secondly there will be slightly more complex, slightly more like this, and eventually the marked ones will be learned later. So, this is applicable for L1 as well as in case of L2, and unmarked properties of L2 would be easier to learn than the marked ones. There is a concept called markedness differential hypothesis given by Ekman. propose that unmarked features of L1 are more likely to be transferred to L2. So, there are these two ideas that that are part of this entire approach. There is this distinction between the marked and unmarked. So, which features are more difficult to learn and which features are easy to learn. So, that is answered by the marked unmarked principle. If it is unmarked, it will be learnt easily. If it is marked, it will be learnt more difficult in case of L2. And which ones get transferred? So, the markedness differential hypothesis says that unmarked properties will be more likely to be transferred from L1 to L2. Now, we move on to form to function mapping. This is yet another approach within the functionalist approach. So, acquisition of both L1 and L2 involves a process of grammaticalization. Now, you do not start the one-to-one mapping of the concept on grammatical structure does not happen in the very beginning. This is true for L1 also. In the beginning, we try to convey the meaning through context. Let us say, we do not say the entire thing, we just by using context. Eventually, we use lexical items to convey the meaning, and then only in the last stage we use grammatical morphemes to do that job. So, in the beginning, shared extra linguistic knowledge and inferencing based on the context of discourse, that is how you convey meaning. This is followed by a lexical item like yesterday, and then finally by a so for example, the property of past tense, the idea of the concept of past tense, it can be when you are learning it even in L1 as well as in L2. When you are learning it in the initial stages, you probably not use any marker. You just that has to be understood in by inferring from the context of use. Then you can probably use a word like yesterday, or if you want to say you want to say a word for future tense, you might use later or tomorrow, something like this, and eventually the grammatical morpheme will appear. So, this is an example that I have quoted. So, this was asked, the question asked here to the person was, what did you do yesterday? So, in the beginning they will say something like I play soccer. There is no mention of any either lexically or grammatically that this playing happened yesterday, but we know it happened yesterday because the question was what did you do yesterday. Eventually, the learners will go to the second stage where they say yesterday I play soccer, and only when they have mastered the language a little better, that is when you get the ED marker. So, the past tense marker appears at the last stage. So, you have yesterday I played. So, gradually getting to the grammaticalization stage. This is called the grammaticalization stage, and the process is called grammaticalization process. The general principle of there is a steady change in this kind of a trajectory. So, initially more reliance on the context or on the lexical item, and eventually increasing reliance on the grammatical forms. So, increasing reliance on grammatical forms and reduced reliance on lexical and contextual information is what the process is all about. Initially, there is more reliance on the extra information or lexical entries, and eventually more on the grammatical. So, that is the trajectory. This is found in all languages. So, basically expressing meaning through context, this has been called the pragmatic mode, and from here you go to what is called the syntactic mode. So, when you are expressing the meaning through context or through other means, that is what is called pragmatic mode, and when you have arrived at the grammaticalization stage where you are using the morphology, grammatical morphology or other kinds of functions whichever the language allows, then you have arrived at the syntactic mode. And this is considered to be evolutionary in nature, meaning it has a gradual progression through over time. So, this gradual development also includes many other as has been proposed, but these are just some I have added, but there are many more. For example, topic comment to subject predicate structure, and then loose conjunction to moving on to tight subordination. So, loose conjunction, for example, elements are merely juxtaposed or connected with and. So, it is not very tightly neat, but as you progress you will have more tight subordination with use like since, because and so on. And then slow rate of delivery under several intonation contours, and then eventually you move on to faster rate of delivery within a single intonational contour. These are the important paradigm, important variables here. Similarly, there will be a balanced ratio of nouns to verbs, and in discourse in the in the beginning, and eventually you move on to larger number of nouns as compared to verbs in the sentence. So, these are various. So, not only you go from the pragmatic mode to syntactic mode, while you are at it, while you are going through that evolutionary stages, those stages you also go through these kind of changes like topic comment to subject predicate kind of a structure and so on, even all the way to the ratio of nouns and verbs. So, when you are having a 1-to-1 noun and verb, basically what is talking about is that you are using only one subject and one verb. So, I do, I go, I walk, like this, and then eventually when you have figured out the case marking, for example, in a language, then you are able to use the direct object, indirect object, subject, everything in the sentence. So, you are able to create a complex structure because by now you have figured out the grammatical rules of the language and you are able to use those morphemes that are required. So, all of these are part of the same evolutionary trajectory that the person goes from in the beginning to the end state in this second language acquisition journey. And then finally, we have another perspective on the functional paradigm, which is called the information organization. The focus here is on the utterance structure, in which the way in which the learners put their words together. This was proposed by Perdue and Klein in 1993 on the basis of a very important study that they carried out. This was basically a project by Klein and colleagues. So, they studied a number of adult immigrants who. So, the study was very interesting. They had studied a number of immigrants from different L1 groups. So, the entire group that they studied had various different kinds of L1 represented as well as different L2 represented, and they were all immigrants to various European in various European countries. So, this was an European Science Foundation project that they carried out, and it was a longitudinal study. They traced the development, longitudinal study covering I think 3 or 4 years. So, during those time they studied the developmental stages of the second language acquisition of those people. So, these people had various L1 like Italian, Punjabi and many others, and they were also learning different kinds of L2. So, this kind of a mixture gave them a very good opportunity to see, to check if the trajectory of the stages, let us say the interlanguages, are similar or do they follow similar kind of pattern across L1 and L2. So, is it a language specific thing, or is it there, or is there some kind of a universal system pertaining to second language acquisition irrespective of whichever L1 and L2. So, that is what the study was all about. And another important factor in this study was all of these people had not received any significant amount of formal training. So, formal training typically in a formal training scenario, the students or the learners will be told overtly the grammatical structures and what to use where and so on. But because these people did not receive them in great degree, so it was also an important variable to see how they naturally learn those things. What is the trajectory? So, the variety of L1 and L2 in the study offered significant insight on the process irrespective of the language. So, the main thing was here the process, not the language, right. The results showed that irrespective of the languages, all learners go through similar stages of interlanguage. So, I have quoted the mapping here. So, they had Punjabi, Italian, Turkish, Arabic, Spanish, Finnish as different kinds of L1 represented native languages, and the target languages were English, German, Dutch, French, Swedish. So, then this and in between they had a lot of intermixing. So, for example, Punjabis were learning English, Italians were also learning English. Similarly, some Italians Italians were learning German, Turkish learning German as well as Dutch. So, it was a very interesting and a mixed group of subjects that they studied, and as a result of which their result also is very important, because they found irrespective of what is the L1, L2 group, like what is the L1 and L2 in a particular person or in a particular group, as well as the same L1 different L2s, same L2 different L1s, all kinds of mixing and matching was possible. And irrespective of all of that complexity, what they found was that there seems to be a pattern across all of these different kinds of participants. So, the data was in one particular case, the data was elicited out of a read speech in English, where they read a story. And for example, some of the examples that the paper gives is on the basis of this. So, nominal utterance organization, this is the first stage, the gradual stages. So, this is the first stage, which they call NUO, nominal utterance organization, where what they do is the subjects, what they did is they just put words together one after another, and they seem to be unconnected because the grammatical markers are not there, the morphemes are not there. They are simply using the words and some and here and there and so on. So, the Punjabi speaker, Punjabi L1 person has said Charlie and girl accident. They were reading the story, they were describing a particular scenario, and this is how they produced. Italian L1, this man, one idea from the window. So, this looks like they were simply taking some words, the basic words that they have learnt, and just putting them one after another. So, this is the first stage. Then there is another stage called infinite utterance organization, UIUO. So, this is a stage where more grammatical forms appear at this stage, but in bare forms. So, the inflections are still not there, but they are at least using more grammatical forms like prepositions and so on. So, the Punjabi speaker, for example, said Charlie and girl and policeman put on the floor. So, there is this kind of a slight more complexity that has been added. Italian speaker, for example, the blonde friend tell other woman about the sun, like this they are discussed. So, they are little bit more complex. And then we have finite utterance organization, which is the final last stage, and as per the proposal, as per the idea proposed by these by the scholars in this paper, they say that many of the learners do not go beyond the second stage, which is the infinite stage. Many of them do not go beyond this, because whatever the use of their language is, do not need them to be a master of the language. This is fine, they can go about without learning beyond this. But people who go beyond this stage attain this particular stage called finite utterance organization. This is the final stage where they start to use grammatical morphemes. So, this is the final stage. So, Punjabi L1, after she said to Charlie, you eat dinner, and then the Italian, he has finished the work, right. So, all of these they are starting to now getting the proper morphological structure in place, and they are using language as it should be. So, these stages are similar to stages of grammaticalization that we just saw in the previous structure, that in the initial stages there are lexical entries, before that there is just contextual information followed by lexical entries followed by grammatical forms. Similar kind of structures have been proposed. So, there is a lot of similarity between this paradigm and the one that we saw before. And so, they propose a set of principles which learners make use for organizing information. While they are going through those stages, there are certain kinds of principles probably that they follow. These principles they have described in detail in the paper. So, there are phrasal constraints, semantic constraints and pragmatic constraints. So, these interact, these features, these principles interact with each other, and as they go through the stages of interlanguages, the relative weight of these principles change. So, in the dependence on each of them will change depending on which stage of interlanguage you are. So, they offer 4, they call it bundles of explanation, not just explanation, 4 bundles to explain what they found. So, the idea is that learners' language development is based on these factors: communicative needs, cross linguistic influences, extrinsic factors and limits on processing. So, limits on processing depends on the individual level as well. So, these are various factors that say that this is what probably can explain the results that they had. So, in the end these subjects, these learners are not trying to learn rules or the structure of the items of the structure, but the primary focus is to construct his or her own language. This construction is permanently challenged by the permanent influx of new input on in the one hand and by various structural inadequacies on the other hand. That is how they explain it. So, it is not that while going from the phase 1 from NUO to the for the final stage, which is FUO, they actually are not trying to learn the rules of the language, they are not trying to memorize the structural properties, but they are just going from, they are creating their own language based on the input, based on their these factors, these 4 factors, and this is in a constant flux. So, this constant flux is of course is a primary property of interlanguages, because it is always changing. So, this is the explanation they have given. So, the structural inadequacy is another factor that they have proposed, Klein and Perdue in the 93 publication. So, these are the leading names in the functional approach, Halliday, Talmy and others. So, to sum up, the functional approaches have these basic principles that are common through all of this. So, we have seen 4 different perspectives within the functional approach, and these properties are constant among all of them. So, SLA deals with acquisition of a system for conveying meaning rather than a acquisition of a set of rules. That is the first thing. The process of this has to do with the learner's creative involvement in the entire process of communication, and the context of use is indispensable. So, these are the 3 primary properties on the basis of which all of these 4 different perspectives are connected. Now, in spite of their important focus on the use and the communicative goal and the learner's own standpoint in terms of the level of creative involvement, the level of access to the UG and so on and so forth, there might be differences. But in spite of all of this focus, we must keep in mind that the functional approach does not negate the innateness hypothesis. They do not negate that there is probably an innate faculty of language that is already there. That is not, it is not in contrast to generativism in that sense. Here the idea is different as to what the learner is trying to achieve and what probably are the main variables for them. But this is also at the same time agreeing that there is an innate faculty of language in this. So, that is where we complete this lecture. In the next lecture, we will take up some other issues. Thank you.